I come from a rather different background. I'm originally a historian. And I'm interested in freedom, both from the point of view of what really exists in the world, and also from the point of view of understanding how philosophers in the last 300 or 400 years have deeply changed in the way that they think about freedom. Freedom is clearly this idea that we have control over our actions and decisions. Deeply interesting idea. It seems, as Rita has said, to separate us off from the rest of nature in a way that modern mind finds very problematic. It also, just as Rita's been saying, seems to play a central role in our ethical life, and particularly in relation to blame and other similar ethical responses. When I blame you, I'm doing something really interesting. I'm not just detecting a fault in you. I could detect a fault in a vase, for example, without blaming it. I'm not just criticising you in the way that I might criticise a human, in the way that I might criticise someone who's foolish or silly, because I might think you made a silly mistake, or made an error of reasoning, but not actually blame you for it. When I blame you, I not only detect a fault in you, but I put it down to you as your fault. So there's a fault in you, and it's your fault. You're responsible for the thing about you that's wrong. And that obviously involves an idea of some form of self-determination. You know, in ordinary rational criticism, if I criticise you, I just think, without blaming you, I might just think, oh well, they're a bit thick, that they made that mistake. They can't help it, it's not their fault. They're just not good at maths or whatever. But when I blame you, I'm saying that the error of reasoning or whatever it is I'm making was your fault. That brings with it the thought that you had the power in some way to determine the matter for yourself. Otherwise, why would it be your fault? So we have here the idea of a power, which is, I think, the idea of a capacity to determine. Now, a lot of philosophers have assumed, because of the clear ethical importance of this idea of self-determination, which we conceive as freedom, it's been up to us how we act. That's why we determine our actions for ourselves, because it's up to us in some way what we do, what we decide. They have wanted to say that this idea of freedom is in some way produced by ethical thought, that it's created in order to perform an ethical function, perhaps rather like doing the job that Rita was talking about. I'm not sure that's true at all. But lots of people think this. The late Bernard Williams, well-known moral philosopher, did a lot of his late work trying to say that the idea of freedom is the production of sort of ethical consciousness. And of course this is a slightly sceptical line, because why should our ethical thought somehow magic up this special feature in nature? It's all too convenient, and one rather really thinks it probably doesn't exist. On the other hand, there are people like Dan Dennett who say, well, let's just be good naturalists. Let's just fit freedom into the natural world as we already understand it, and then we'll let ethics look after itself at the end of the game. And perhaps not a lot of ethics will necessarily survive the Dan Dennett machine, but we'll see. And a lot of English language philosophical thought about freedom has gone in either of these two directions. You either do a naturalist domestication of freedom, so it's a sort of familiar part of causal nature, and that may leave less there than you initially thought. Or you do a sort of quasi-sceptical approach to it, which says it's production of ethical thought. Let me put forward to you very quickly a sort of a third path. The idea of a power is actually a very general idea. There are lots of powers in the world, lots of capacities to determine. There's causation, for example. Bricks hit windows, they determine that the window breaks. Causes have power, they can determine what happens. There are legal powers, normative powers. If you owe me money, I have the capacity to determine whether or not you remain in debt to me. That's a power. And immediately we see that the notion of a power is very general. There are lots of different kinds of powers. So the mere fact that our ethical thought commits us to the existence of a kind of power over our actions doesn't immediately tell us very much about what this power needs to be like. What does it need to be like? Well, that's the question. And of course, central to the question is the relationship between this power of freedom and another power that I've already just mentioned in nature, which is causal power. The power we think we have over our actions is a very interesting power because it seems to be essentially two-way. When I think of myself as having capacity to determine what I do, I immediately think of, I use the phrase, it's up to me what I do, it's up to me what I decide. So we seem to have a strange capacity to determine that could be exercised in more than one way. And that seems to be essential to it. You know, if I have control over my actions, it's up to me whether I raise my hand or lower it. The same power that I could exercise to raise my hand could be exercised to lower it. That's unlike causal powers. Causal powers can easily be one way. The brick has only one power to produce one effect when it hits the window, to break it. That's all it does. Whereas we seem to have a two-way power. And of course, at the heart of the free will problem is the relationship between this two-way power and past causal powers attaching to past events. If my actions are causally predetermined, could they be up to me? Could the power I have over my actions be consistent with the causal power exercised over me by past events and states that has possibly pre-existed my birth even? How do we answer this question? We've got a question now about the relationship between one kind of power and another kind of power. Freedom is power we have over our actions, causal power attaching to past events and states. How are we going to solve this problem? And solving it is going to tell us something about what freedom is and what it commits us to. Incompatibilists, as you know, people think that there's an utter inconsistency between the causal power attaching to past events and states and this power we have over our actions. And most of us, I think, are natural incompatibilists. Whenever I teach free will to starting philosophy students, most of them are inclined to think that if their actions were causally predetermined, it wouldn't any longer be up to them how they act. Where does this idea come from? Some people in philosophy want to say it's a conceptual matter, and it may have something to do with ethical thought. I very much doubt that is the case, partly because no one has actually produced any conceptual arguments to establish the incompatibility between freedom and causal determination of our actions by past events and states. There's a whole literature, which I won't go into and I don't have time, which has utterly failed to resolve the matter by conceptual argument. And indeed, why should you expect to resolve the question about the relationship between one power and another power by conceptual argument? If I want to work out whether one lever with a certain causal power is consistent with the operation of another lever with another kind of causal power, I wouldn't go in for conceptual argument. I'd go and look, I'd set one up and see how it works with the other one. It could perfectly well be that if there is such a thing as a power of freedom, its relationship to other powers, such as causation, is not a conceptual matter, but an empirical one. It could also be that our intuitions concerning this causal power are based not on concepts, not on ethical theory, but actually on experience. Now, this is something that modern philosophy has desperately not wanted to say, because from the days of Hobbes and Hume, it's tended to assume that powers are not directly represented to us in experience. That's the heart, say, of David Hume's theory of causation. We never actually see any causal power in nature. And if causal power is never represented to us in experience, why should the power of freedom be either? And sort of Humanism and Kantianism are both agreed we never experience a power of freedom of the sort we ordinarily seem to believe in. I think we do. I think actually we do have a sense of being in control of our actions and of losing control. And I strongly think, but I'm going to have to end very soon because I expect I'm running out of time, I strongly think that the widespread intuition in favour of incompatibilism is based on the way this phenomenological representation of the power of control works, and the way it represents our control over our actions' relationship to the causal impact on us of events and states outside our will, like those of the emotions. And that's the research programme that I and a number of other philosophers are beginning to embark on. This doesn't resolve the free will problem. It merely changes the way you look at it. But I think it also raises doubts about whether our intuitions about freedom are actually come from ethics. I think they come from phenomenology and then inform ethics and structure the conditions under which we think someone really can be to blame. And there I'll stop.
Thank you very much.